So you couple these, tax breaks, tax incentives with capitalism, American ingenuity, we could probably do some pretty big things here in terms of, you know, where we're at in our energy development, energy sourcing, diversification of energy here in the US.
From Resilient Partners, this is the Resilient Insights Podcast. Every episode offers in-depth insights on the key debates and conversations shaping Washington and the world. From policy to leadership to the lighter side of life, we're your source for thoughtful discussions. So get ready to be informed, inspired, and engaged. Welcome to the Resilience Insights Podcast. I'm your guide on this journey, Joshua Baca, walking you through the intricate world of public policy, leadership, and the lighter side of life. On today's episode, we've got a special guest, Randy Charles from Greenway Steel, where we're going to talk about a very wonky topic called carbon border adjustments and sustainable steelmaking. Randy, welcome to the show.
Hey, 10-4, and thank you. Appreciate that. I appreciate too. We're talking about a wonky topic, man.
Hey, wonkier the better in my view. So why don't we start here, Randy? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Greenway Steel and the mission you're on there?
Sure. 30-year industry veteran of the steel and metal supply chain industry. Founded Greenway Steel a few years ago. We started out simply as a blog spot to share with folks what we were learning about decarbonization of the steel industry, green steel technology, and as well, greenhouse gas emissions. And we ultimately found some solutions that we thought that people were going to need in this initiative around sustainability.
So you have found a way to make sustainability cool from what I understand, and have had some groundbreaking sort of efforts in your mission to make steel a little bit more sustainable. What inspired you at the end of the day in your founding of Greenway Steel?
It was really research around what was happening with the decarbonization of our industry. And it really, being in the steel industry for 30 years and much of it involved in the implementation of new technology, particularly what would be called mini mill steel manufacturing and production. I started to see similarities in what was happening, maybe even more significant on a global scale, decarbonizing the process that led us to want to do a lot of research into it. Ultimately, steelmaking globally accounts for about 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. And, steel is used everywhere. Any developing economy is going to use a lot more steel, is going to need steel. It's used for everything. So, both companies and countries are spending billions of dollars directed towards decarbonizing this process. And then on the other side of the coin, we have the producers of steel intensive goods that are going to be meeting a demand for sustainable goods, okay, and sustainable products and decarbonizing their supply chains. And at Greenway Steel, what we aim to do is connect the dots across the supply chain.
We have had a theme on this show where we've talked with several guests about sustainability. And it seems like we're at this really important intersection right now where sustainability has always been cool and wonky and all that good stuff. But it's also coming into this intersection where it's becoming a profit center for companies, or it's going to become a profit center for companies. One of the things that I think I was most intrigued by was your carbon calculator that you guys developed. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And is it part of that intersection that I'm talking about here?
Well, yeah, for sure. In fact, it's almost a starting point, a building block from, where you kind of embark on an initiative around sustainability, but it's all part of understanding, your footprint in the supply chain. But we developed the Greenway calculator. It is built right off the greenhouse gas protocols. Okay. But what we wanted to do for our industry was provide very specific processes, energy sources, sources of emissions into that calculator, for mobile equipment and custom oxy fuels, things like that would enable our clients to very efficiently and very accurately come up with an emissions footprint. And of course, scope 3 is a complicated component of a greenhouse gas accounting, if you will. And we've got specific solutions for that as well within the Greenway calculator.
Scope 3 is the hardest piece of this whole pie. How do you utilize it today in calculating scope 3 emissions?
Well, it is scope 3, right? There's 15 categories of scope 3 emissions. And, if you really, if you go down that, I hate to say, going down a rabbit hole and try to tackle all of those, okay, that includes everything from your employee commuters to business travel, capital goods, waste management. I could go on and on. If you go down that rabbit hole, you're going to invest a tremendous amount of time trying to come up with solutions, to measure and calculate these things. But, this early in the game, I think the real key is to consider what's impactful on the business. And in accounting, that's often referred to as, doing a materiality assessment, right? And within the metal supply chain, there's two components that it's pretty clearly going to be material, and that's going to be the purchase goods, and that's going to be the logistics around those. And if you look at those for right now, and they're reasonably, I don't want to say simple, but that you can get a handle on them pretty quickly, particularly now with the development of what's called environmental product declarations. But you could bring those into your accounting. You could get good handle on what a supply chain footprint looks like, and you're covering what's material right now today for your value chain or supply chain emissions.
So if I'm a steel maker today and I pick up the phone and I call Randy Charles, how are you going to help me?
All right, now let's think about where we're positioned. Greenway Steel. Now, on the steel producing side, the manufacturers have had to report to the EPA now for many, many years their emissions footprint. Okay, so they're well along in that process. And ultimately for steel producers, the most efficient producers, the most efficient in terms of energy efficiency, that just simply translates into low carbon footprint. And that's one of the things that I learned years and years and years in the steel industry, with laser focused on energy intensity, every month looking at that. When it ultimately came down to looking at the footprint, we understood that it was about energy and energy efficiency, and the most efficient supply chains were going to be the most sustainable. Okay. So what we're doing is we're taking that over to the metal supply chain. So that anyone involved, the manufacturers of steel intensive goods, distributors, processors of steel, anyone involved in the logistics side of the equation, or even upstream from the steel producers on the raw materials and recycling side of the equation, we bring to them solutions that, because they don't have the resources that a big steel producing manufacturing company is going to have on the environmental and engineering side.
That's awesome. Great, great, great insight there. One of the things that got you and I connected was to our good friend, Jennifer Betts. And you and I started having a conversation about carbon border adjustment mechanisms.
Yeah.
And you had sent me a blog post, and I admittedly was not as well versed on this as I thought I would be. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole and started reading a little bit about what you all had been putting out there. And it brought me to this whole debate that's been going on over legislation like the Prove It Act
Yeah.
and TC climate disclosures and things happening in California and in the EU. So let's start right there. I want to dive in a little bit about carbon border adjustment mechanisms, because I think this is be an emerging topic that's going to
Yeah.
dominate the public policy space in the next couple of years. What is a carbon border adjustment mechanism? And why should someone listening to this podcast care about that?
All right. Carbon border adjustment mechanism. It really, you got to think about a carbon border adjustment mechanism is kind of like a left hand to a right hand being an internal or domestic carbon price or liability. Okay. So, and let's talk specifically about the EU, because that's where CBAM, carbon border adjustment, is being implemented. Okay. Now, in the EU, they've had the emissions trading system in place. So they essentially, companies that are participating in specific industries in the EU have a carbon liability. Now, initially on the onset, they were assigned credits that they could use towards their emissions, but over some period of time, those credits are reducing, and then they start to have to purchase credits, and then you have the price established for carbon. Okay. Now, technically, if your domestic producers have a liability associated with carbon, what you need to prevent is this idea around leakage. So you don't need to have imports coming in that don't have the same regulatory, burdens around carbon being, substituting your products that are produced domestically, because then all you do is move emissions from your domestic producers into some importing country. Okay. So what they do is they implement the carbon border adjustment mechanism that basically accounts for the emissions in the producing countries' products that are being imported into the EU. Okay. So that's what CBAM is.
CBAM. Okay. So what about the Prove It Act? There was some legislation in Congress,
Yeah.
bipartisan. Tell us a little bit about the Prove It Act and how that CBAM or carbon border adjustment mechanism could happen here in the U.S.
Okay. So last year, at the end of the year, it passed through Senate. Acronyms, right? Everything's about an acronym.
Everything in DC is an acronym.
Look, providing reliable, objective, verifiable emissions intensity was the intent of the Prove It Act. Okay, now essentially what the Prove It Act would do was require, really, it's going to be the Department of Energy, but a federal agency to identify the emissions intensities of various industries and energy products, as well as say solar panels and wind turbines, but identify the emissions intensities of steel, aluminum, fertilizer, things like that, but also natural gas, oil, uranium, and some of the products I referenced. But not just for the U.S., but for the G7 countries, anyone that we have a free trade agreement with, and then as well, countries of concern that would be China, Russia, and Iran. So over a period of time, we would identify an emissions intensity associated with all these products in all these countries and start to understand where the differences might exist.
So if I manufacture steel in China and it's being imported into the US, but let's say their carbon footprint to make that is much higher than the
Yeah.
steel we manufacture in the US, there's a fee or a tariff placed on that. Is that correct?
Well, of course, not under the Prove It Act. No, no. But
I mean,
that's
that could be what a CBAM does though, right?
yeah, well, that's for sure what a CBAM would do. That's right.
Okay.
Now,
But prove it act. Yeah, go ahead.
let's think about we could think about both the supporters of the Prove It Act, because there's an awful lot of people that are behind it. I mean, it's at the
Yeah.
end of the day, it's a bipartisan proposal. But of course, just like anything, there's an awful lot of detractors to it.
Who are some of those detractors?
Well, it's the same people that are supporting it well, the same reason people support it is ultimately it's a foundation for a carbon tax. Okay. So,
Yeah.
detractors to this would say, hey, look, it's just paving the way for a carbon tax. Now, the reality is the Prove It Act doesn't require a carbon tax, but it makes a carbon tax possible. Now, implementing a CBAM necessarily isn't a carbon tax on your domestic producers necessarily. Well, I guess in some ways it could be considered that because that implies that you have a domestic internal carbon liability. Okay. But ultimately, having an efficient accounting and accurate accounting of the emissions intensities of these various products from the various countries is the way to implement this thing, correctly. And that's the intent of, what we're trying to do, what the legislative folks behind the Prove It Act are trying to do.
So some transparency under the Prove It Act. If your product,
Okay, well, yeah, right. Yeah.
yeah, but here's what the carbon intensity is to make steel, glass, aluminum, whatever those products are under the Prove It Act. Here's the transparency behind.
That's exactly right. Yeah, no, the case, solar panels are a great example, right?
Yeah.
The issues around bringing solar panels into the U.S. from China. China in
A
many
big issue here about that. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Now, right, so it's the lowest cost, let's say lowest price, right? But it's truly the lowest cost if you factor in, the carbon intensity behind it. So you might look at it from you hear we're implementing solar for a lot of reasons associated with, green renewable energy supply. But if you're using products that might not have been produced efficiently, with the lowest possible emissions footprint, are you really accomplishing what you set out to do? And so under the Prove It Act, we would have good, like you say, transparent. It's transparent information relative to carbon intensities of the various products. So the interesting thing about a carbon trade. And really, that's where all this is leading to. Carbon and emissions are in trade are going to be intertwined, right? I mean, even just last week, the Biden administration announced a task force associated with carbon and trade and working on that. But what's interesting, at least in my mind and my perspective relative to trade in carbon, is that there are mechanisms in place for people to challenge subsidies around the country. Even going all the way to the WTO. But at the end of the day, if you get right down to it, carbon footprint, carbon intensity, you can't hide behind that. It is what it is,
Yeah.
and it's a true cost. And so you could subsidize a lot of production and processing and all that. But at the end of the day, if you have a lower carbon footprint, you're probably the most energy efficient. You're probably the most sustainable in some way, shape, or form. So it's a unique way of going at trade from some perspective.
And do you think if with the transparency behind the Prove It Act, as we've been calling it, does that make domestic manufacturers more competitive in the global trading markets?
Oh, well, and that's why an awful lot of domestic manufacturers would support this, domestic trade organizations would support this, is that the U.S. has what you'd call a carbon advantage. And this, Joshua, this is what's really cool about understanding the U.S.'s competitive position. Okay, think about it from the idea that the EU's highly regulated,
Very
kind of
so. Yeah.
block, if you will, and so they are regulating emissions and through the ETS and now subsequently the CBAM. But see, think about that from the perspective of the U.S. We're purely a voluntary market, right? A lot of this hasn't been regulated, but yet where are we at today? We're an exceptionally efficient economy, at least from a manufacturing base and a steel production base. And we've done it for all the right reasons because essentially we're focused on efficiency, saving energy. Okay. So you fast forward to today and we're really a very low carbon footprint kind of producing country. So we have what's called a carbon advantage, to China, India, and many, many other countries. And so if the objective is to reduce global emissions, all right, you need to, if you will, encourage people, outside of the U.S. or people, but countries and economies outside of the U.S. to do the same things that we've done here in the U.S. over all this many years for the right reasons.
Do we have that carbon trading advantage because of what feedstock
Well, no,
technology?
it's efficiency, it's technology, man. It's just good old fashioned American ingenuity, right?
Yeah,
Capitalism that worked.
yeah, capitalism. Yeah,
It probably and now if you look at it from the perspective of the IRA and really the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS Act, all of these acts and now laws, they're providing well considered tax incentives, tax breaks from some perspectives. All these things have ultimately led, the US, to be well placed in terms of carbon efficiency.
I think we're going to look back at this time frame as that moment, right? As you mentioned, the investments in the CHIPS Act, the IRA, variety of other things that are happening. We're going to look back on that and be like, that was the moment where this became very real for the world. And the US had, if successful, the US steps out and is the leader in this space.
Yeah, interesting perspective. Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. And clearly, when the IRA was passed, it got a lot of attention in the
Yeah.
EU, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of attention in the EU. Yeah.
There were global manufacturing CEOs who were saying that the EU would be uncompetitive compared to the US because of the IRA. So tells you a lot.
Yeah.
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 Let's
Well,
talk.
yeah, think about it. This is from again, we talked about a regulatory environment versus a voluntary
Yeah.
market. In a regulatory environment, what do participants try to do, right? To meet the minimum requirements and look for loopholes.
Yeah.
It's pretty.
Look-
Yeah. The
Yeah.
pluses in a regulatory environment are where the guardrails are, and you can
Yeah.
make investment decisions based off of what is going to come down the road next year and 5 years from now.
Yeah.
In a voluntary market in the U.S., it's different, right? You got to really consider what your stakeholders, are looking for, what your customers want, where the technology is going, and where you're going to make investments accordingly. So in some ways, it could be considered more efficient, right? But in some ways, it can be considered, say, more difficult too, because you can make bets that don't pan out, perhaps
Okay.
because you don't know ultimately what the end game is going to be. So it's just there's pluses and minuses either way we go. It's interesting to see how it ultimately led, though, in the U.S. and being very efficient. You know,
One of the things that I think is really important in the policymaking process is the coalition building side of this. So we talked a little bit about the detractors. Who are the opponents in favor of things like CBAM and the Prove It Act?
so folks that okay, so let's say
And others
folks that are taking exception to the Prove It Act.
are in favor of.
But in favor, okay, again, in favor, the Steel Manufacturers Association is a great example,
Okay.
right? They recognize the carbon advantage of the steel producing industry, so they're supporting the Prove It Act. Hey, let's be transparent. We know where we're at in terms of the emissions intensity and the footprint of our domestic steel producers. Let's compare it with real world numbers and accurate numbers with the rest of the world.
That's right.
That's a classic example of someone that's I'm a proponent of moving forward on this.
What do you see climate disclosure law regulations and the climate disclosure laws in California? Is there some overlap with these topics that we're talking about here?
Oh, yeah, for sure, right, and actually the California one actually, in some respects, is probably bigger than a federal SEC requirement because it brings in both private companies and it includes Scope 3, so there's overlap there, and in fact, it'll get challenged, from folks saying, "Hey, essentially the act's, regulating a much broader mandate than the state should have." It's gonna get challenged from any number of legal perspectives. I'll share with you an interesting story on the California laws, right? So under this, the requirements of the SEC and disclosing your emissions and under the California law, right? A lot of the concerns are around the burdens, right? The regulatory burdens. Now, when the California laws had passed, it was notable in that there were very little details on how the law was actually going to be implemented. And subsequently, Gavin Newsom came out and said, "Hey, look at, given some of the budget deficit issues we have, we can't even really fund this right now, to build up a bureaucracy and people to start to create the rules under which this law is going to be implemented." Now, they were sued immediately, right? People had lawsuits just waiting in the wings for the second this would pass. So, and they were sued that it would be too burdensome. Now, here's California's defense, and this is classic. They said, "Well, how do you know it's going to be too burdensome? We haven't even written the rules yet." Right, right. People are gonna sue it, and they're gonna sue
Right.
it. It's just a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah.
And California's right. We haven't even drawn up the laws yet. We haven't even drawn up the rules for how we're gonna implement this, and you're telling us it's too burdensome. You don't even know.
Judging a book by its cover before you've read the book.
That's right.
Or
Yeah,
the book has even been written, I guess, maybe in this
yeah,
regard.
it's a clear. I mean, we saw what happened with the SEC requirement. So, what was it, 2022 when it was the first announced? And I think they went through 3 stages of public comments, and they had more public comments on this than anything that they've ever done. And they pushed it off, pushed it off, and pushed it off. And I thought that they were trying to line it with some of what's developing internationally with the sustainability standards and line it. And ultimately, only in a much smaller perspective did they do that. But ultimately, it was they were trying to draft something that threaded the needle between people that were concerned about it being a problem and people that are concerned, "Hey, we really need this." And it looks like in threading the needle, they got both sides taking exception to what they tried to do. So, you've got legal challenges from people that think it's an overreach by a federal agency that's outside of their legislative requirements. And then you got people on the other side that are saying, "Hey, it doesn't go far enough." So they got sued on both sides. And then they ultimately just had to postpone implementing it.
Help me bring all of this together. You've got California, you've got the EU, you've got legislation like the Prove It Act, you got the SEC climate disclosure. How does all of this merge in the next 5 to 10 years, and what is the outcome of this?
Yeah, again, we talked about this. Trade in emissions and carbon are going to be intertwined. And really, I think that uh, as we approach 2030, that we're going to see this thing start to accelerate the momentum behind it. We're seeing that just in the 2 years that we've been around at Greenway Steel. When we were originally talking to people, we were just kind of educating people on what emissions even were.
Yeah.
And now today we're into much more complex discussions about how do we prepare for this? What do we and yes, of course, it's all going to change depending on whatever administration might be in place in November. At least the rhetoric behind it. But the underlying currents are this thing is moving. The capital behind, whatever we want to call it, an energy transition, greenhouse gas emissions reductions necessary to tackle climate change. The momentum in the capital behind this thing is incredible, and that so many people are behind coming up with solutions for this and investing their time and their smarts and their money behind coming up with solutions. So this thing's moving and it's gaining speed, and trade is going to be tied to emissions and the if you will, the clean production of your products. I just don't see any other way around it. And in some way, shape, or form, there's going to be a liability associated with carbon. And you think about even in the IRA, if there's a price put on methane, right?
Yeah.
And that there could very easily be translated into what's the equivalency in carbon. So there basically is a CO2 price that's now being established, and as well the tax credits associated with carbon capture under 45Q. If you start to say that's $75 worth of tax credits versus something that's going to cost $250, I mean you put a price on carbon in some way, shape, or form, I mean, we've already got a price of carbon in California, a price of carbon in the EU, right? There's a price of carbon in Korea, that price of carbon's determined differently than say it is in the EU. Even China's putting a price on carbon. And of course, people question any numbers coming out of there from some perspectives, but there's carbon liability. Consider it. A lot of companies will write even assign a carbon liability in their own internal financial accounting, right?
Yeah. What about when you think about the world? I guess maybe a different way I think about it. In my company, Resilient Partners, we're a government and public affairs company. So I'm going to actually play role reverse with you. I'm going to ask you to put on my hat. We have three principles that guide us. We say resilience is the foundation for navigating the complex world of government affairs and the regulatory process that we're talking about. We say you got to be proactive in shaping the policy environment, and you have to focus on trust to turn your individual company priorities into broader societal movements. So with those three principles, and for stakeholders who are listening today, what advice would you give them?
I I love the idea that resilience has to be a part of the equation, right? When you're dealing with the government, right? Policy, the politicians and the political environment today,
Yeah.
this idea of having resilience, right? I think we could all agree with that. You know, I think and this is just, my opinion that I share with our partner clients is, it gets started today. It,
Yeah.
it gets started. And here's the deal. Y- we might not know exactly what's going to happen, exactly how it's going to play. I mean, we can't even predict who's going to win the election in November and how and that
Nobody,
might things. Yeah. So it,
and anybody who tells you what's going to happen is not telling you the truth right now.
yeah, that's right. So why not get started today? Get a team of people in your organization kind of calibrated on this idea around sustainability. Understand what your carbon footprint is, how to get to it, how to arrive at it, and just have your eye on the ball, so to speak. Right. So whether it's a fastball or a curveball that comes down the pike at you, you're going to be able to take a good swing at it. And you can always adjust depending on how things play out, but you're only going to be able to do that if you've built kind of a baseline, kind of a plan and strategy around sustainability. And the perspective of influencing it, without a doubt, yeah, sharing your thoughts. I guess, how do we do that? I mean, if you have someone representing you in DC or at the state level too, I mean, you can only influence those results if you truly understand what's being proposed, right?
Yeah.
And understanding that and understanding how it's going to impact your business in some way, shape, or form, you could then, kind of say, hey, this is what we like about it. This is what we don't like about it. There's real concerns with CBAM. CBAM ultimately, if it works effectively, it's going to reduce global emissions, right? It's going to encourage people, if they want to bring products into your country, to reduce their emissions so they don't have costs associated with it. But if CBAM just ends up to be some kind of protectionist thing, that
That,
just, shifts emissions productions around. Then it's not all this work and effort and regulatory requirements. It's done nothing
yeah.
to solve the problem, so you really need to be engaged in it in a way that you could help to identify, issues, carbon leakage. Think about in the EU, uh, you know, let's say that, someone in Serbia brings in Chinese electrical steels to produce electrical motors, and then they ship them into the EU to be placed into EVs, right? Okay. Now all because, you can't import steel into the EU under CBAM without the expense. Has that solved the problem? No. And see, those are the kind of issues that need to be identified under CBAM, in implementing these regulatory requirements. And so you need to speak up for your business and your interests in that regard.
Let's have some fun here, Randy. One of the things that we do on the episodes of the Resilient Insights podcast is we like to talk about the lighter side of life. One question I ask all of my guests, so we could take it one or two routes. You could be a baseball player or a DJ. Which one would you rather be?
Well, I'd be a relief pitcher. Oh,
Okay.
okay, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, how
You're-
about where are you at on that? I mean, you're in DC. That's fun baseball country
yeah,
there.
oh yeah. So here's the question then. You chose baseball. You're coming in the ninth inning, Randy. You're closing out the game for your favorite team or the team you're playing for. What's your entrance song?
Oh, come on. Thunderstruck just rock and rolls at every
Thunderstruck. There we go.
I don't, but I like to start me up. The Rolling
Okay.
Stones. Come on, that's a good one too. But Thunderstruck, come
If
on, there's so many good ones.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I think if you're closing out the ninth inning of an important baseball game and you're coming out of the bullpen, Thunderstruck, is the right. You need something for that closer that really sets the momentum. So I
yeah.
agree.
No, so I don't, you must have thought about this. Come on, man. What's
My
your
for me, my walk-up song would probably be if I were a hitter coming into the baseball game, I'd probably go "Welcome to the Jungle" by Guns N' Roses. And if I were a relief pitcher coming in from the bullpen, I'd want to throw a curveball at somebody and have like a Britney Spears song or something totally random that you think to be big and intimidating, but you're coming out to like Britney Spears or Taylor Swift or something.
Well, that's classic.
That would be my approach to taking on that one.
Yeah, that's good. Well, of course, and then right, John Fogerty's "Put Me in,
Oh,
Coach." Yeah.
yeah, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Well, Randy, we're up at time. I want to thank you for a really robust and in-depth conversation. Thank you for your insights, by the way. Really amazing insights. Anything, where can people find you? Let's do that.
At greenwaysteel.com. And then, of course, we're on LinkedIn. And then we have the Greenway newsletter, which we share a lot of information that's developing. And Joshua, thank you. And a lot of respect for your timing on this because, CBAM's just getting implemented. And I'm getting questions from a lot of folks here. It's just in the past weeks alone as people are having reporting requirements come to them. So your timing is pretty good. You get it. And I respect that. And I respect talking to you about it. Thank you.
Let's keep this conversation going because it's not going away. And I'll make a plug for you. If you don't subscribe to Randy's newsletter on Greenway Steel on LinkedIn, do so. It's an excellent newsletter. It has great information, great content. It's your newsletter that put me down a rabbit hole. So thank you for doing that. I like going down the rabbit hole, but very insightful stuff. And let's keep this conversation going.
Yeah. Hey, on the newsletter too, there's no AI behind it, man. It's written by a professional writer.
That's great.
And I have a lot of respect for his expertise.
That's really good stuff to know. Well, I appreciate that, Randy. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our listeners for listening. Remember, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Give us a like or a follow on LinkedIn. Find us on Instagram. Do all the social media stuff. All of those small actions go a long way to promoting the podcast. So until next time, keep on listening. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you.